All right, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to this wonderful final session on the profound impact of local carbon projects. My name is Lisa Ferguson. I'm the Senior Advisor for Equitable Carbon Markets at the Nature Conservancy, which means that I spend a lot of my time, most of my working time, thinking about how do we really design carbon markets in a way that serves in true stewardship of the communities and the ecosystems who are really at those projects' center. This is my first North American Carbon World, and something thank you. Something I've seen over the last 2.5 days is that, we're all coming from different places, different areas of expertise, different areas of focus, but I think we all have something in common in that we're all really here to help create that better future, whether that's for ourselves, our communities, for the generations to come. And I think that's what you're going to hear from these three excellent speakers next to me is how the projects that they're engaged in are really one of the best ways, if not the best way, to do exactly that. So I'm going to give some quick introductions and then hand it over to these wonderful folks. To my left, we have Bryan van Stippen, who is the Program Director of the National Indian Carbon Coalition, which partners with tribal nations and indigenous communities to both sequester carbon and strengthen sovereignty. We have Dani Warren, the Senior Manager for Sales at Great Bear Carbon, whose shareholders are coastal First Nations, and Gonzalo Martínez Mayer, who is the co-founder of Carbon Plus Mexico, who also works very closely with indigenous communities to design carbon projects across the country. So I'm going to let each of you talk a bit more about yourselves and the work that you do. Let's maybe kick it off with, of course, feel free to introduce yourself more, talk about a project that you're engaged in, but in that, maybe talk about a specific moment that really resonated with you that drove home why this work is so important. And Bryan, we'll kick it off with you.
Certainly, so appreciate that, Lisa. Segulian Yako, I greet you in my traditional language as a member of the United Nation of Wisconsin. So again, our organization, the National Indian Carbon Coalition, we engage with tribal nations and indigenous communities throughout North America, including Alaska Native Villages and Corporations, Native Hawaiian organizations, as well as First Nations in Canada. So that's the group that we engage with to focus on enrolling these natural resource bases into ecosystem markets. And some of our projects, specifically one that we have been highlighting here the last few days at North American Carbon World in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, has been a project with the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa, northern Minnesota. And in that project, what we have done in that partnership and with the tribe itself and with the Nature Conservancy is the reacquisition of 28,000 acres of ancestral lands that were in the exterior boundaries of the reservation that was owned by a former timber harvesting organization. Return those lands, ancestral lands, back to the tribes through some financing mechanisms. And then on the back end, we are now developing a carbon project on those lands to pay back that debt obligation, as well as to restore the lands to its traditional status, because obviously it was owned by a timber harvesting organization. It's now degraded over time from the harvesting activities. So the utilization of the carbon revenue to pay back not only the debt that the tribe had to take on for the acquisition of the land, but then to restore the land, hire additional staff to steward that land is integral and important as a part of these projects. So we have worked on this. It's being designed under VERA's VM0045. It's going to be, it is the second project listed underneath that protocol, but it's on the largest land base underneath the current protocol. And we are also attaching VERA's CCB certification, the Climate Community and Biodiversity certification, so that will be the first project in North America to be under 45 with CCB certification, because we believe at the National Indian Carbon Coalition that is extremely important to develop high quality, high integrity carbon projects on tribal and indigenous lands. So again, this is one of the projects that we have. We have others that we have developed, are currently in development. But as we go out and we tell these stories, not only within Indian country, but also at events like NACW, to partners that are in the room and have been at the event the last few days. They learn more about the work that we are doing through our nonprofit organization with these tribal nations and indigenous communities to bring in other partnerships that we need to develop and work on these projects, because we can't always do this work on our own. We need assistance like entities like TNC that have the technical assistance, the skill sets that we don't always have internally, either through our organization or at the tribes themselves. So we appreciate these partnerships. We appreciate these opportunities to engage and to talk about our projects. I hope that everybody had a chance to come through the exhibition center and see our project. If you have not, we are part of the Nature Conservancy's Living Carbon series that was just promoted right before we came out here for NACW. So you'll be seeing more of that, but feel free to reach out and connect with us to learn more about that project.
Great, thanks, Bryan. Yeah, I think really incredible emphasis on the importance of those partnerships that it takes to really come together for the carbon, but also for so much more than that on these lands. Dani, up to you.
It's always difficult to follow Bryan.
We work together a lot.
So myself, I'm from Montreal Lake Cree Nation, which is Treaty 6 territory, Saskatchewan, in Canada, and been on the coast now of BC in Canada on the West Coast for many years. I'm quite honored to work with the communities that I represent today. Great Bear Carbon, my company, is owned by 7 First Nations, so indigenous communities. Canada, we call certain types of indigenous communities different names, and the ones I work for are called First Nations. We represent a total of 10 communities, and we sell their carbon offsets into voluntary and compliance markets. At the surface level, that's what I do. What brings me to the space and the work is, where does the offset revenues go? I come into the space not as an environmentalist, although that is core to myself. It's really for the reconciliation of indigenous peoples. How do we create economic pathways to protect, conserve the land, and allow for healing and opportunity in communities? And so moving from the prairies of Canada to the coast, I was blown away by what the communities I work for have done. To be able to come together in the late 1990s, work together to say, there's heavy commercial fishing, destructive logging practices, what's happening to our territory, and how do we assert ourselves in a way where we can grow our communities, have people return in cases where they've left, and heal. I think it's important to this conversation and to myself and to the history of even my own family is to understand some of the history of indigenous peoples in Canada's. And I think what we often see in the media is about residential schools. We'll use that as an example where many indigenous children were mistreated. For me, that was my mother's generation. Getting a little emotional. and her mother's generation. And so, sorry. I'm lucky to be a part of this work because I sell assets to heavy emitters, to voluntary, nonprofit, oil and gas, pulp and paper, and that money goes back to community for language programs, for Coastal Guardian Watchmen, for marine protection, so many different uses, but always benefiting the land, the waters, and the people. And for the communities to come together and build agreements with British Columbia government is so key. I'll go into a bit more of that later. But having that foundation of, as we call it, government to government, indigenous governments at the table with provincial government in our case, to be able to create pathways to say communities want to grow, want to develop their communities further, but also benefiting government relations and to be able to share atmospheric benefits in the long run. Is really where the revenues go that brings me to this space and makes me honored to be a part of the work.
Yeah. Thank you, Dani. I think what's so incredible about the work that each of you do is that it really shows how carbon finance and carbon projects actually touches down. And it's about, of course, we're here to talk about carbon projects and carbon markets, but this is about heart, this is about values, and that's what this can really enable. And I think what you'll continue to share throughout this will really, really drive that home. So thank you for sharing that. Gonzalo, off to you.
Thank you, Lisa. It's always difficult to follow Bryan and Dani. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. First time for me as well here in the North American carbon world. I want to thank the Climate Action Reserve for providing me with the opportunity to speak on behalf of not just Carbon Plus, but so many other developers and local allies which are doing a fantastic job, at least in Mexico, of course, nationally. And I think it's so important to get that voice from the indigenous communities out there, because it's not just about carbon, it's about recognition, it's about history, it's about sovereignty, jurisdiction. So really happy to be here. Well, as carbon developers in Mexico, and nature-based carbon forestry, mainly in Mexico, we work with many different indigenous communities because there are so many different groups in such a small area of space, at least in Mexico. 3 different communities, for example, Mije, Soque, Tepehuanes, and I've seen, for example, communities here present in San Diego, which come in representation of their, and giving a voice to their community. I find that forestry, carbon stewardship is a way to go beyond the normal conversation regarding just carbon, accountability, for example, quantification, leakage, additionality, but those co-benefits and the social impact that we can generate with these projects, it's many times not strengthened or highlighted enough. So for me, it's an honor to be talking about this topic, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, I was on listening in on another panel that I think you were also on, where they referred to this as core benefits instead of co-benefits. And I think that really showing how much this can enable beyond the carbon is so important to just creating that better future that we're all here for. Dani, I'd love to circle back to what you said, because this always sticks with me when I'm working with communities on whether it's a carbon project or another type of project, that a really good project can be about so much more than carbon or even more than economic opportunity. It can really be about that reconciliation, that healing, that sovereignty. This can create pathways for people to reconnect with their lands, their waters, their language, their cultures, maybe in ways that they haven't before or maybe haven't in a long time. Can you talk a little bit more about how you've seen that play out in practice and why that's such an important part of the carbon projects that you're engaged in?
Absolutely. A word that you've mentioned in your question is reconciliation. I think it's kind of a hot topic in Canada, has been for many years, certainly in North America. And I go back to, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? And that's exactly, what you're asking. What's the tangible form of reconciliation? Think about a story I heard quite recently about a man in one of our communities who was living homeless in the city of Vancouver. And because he wasn't doing well, he decided to go home. His family brought him home to his community. Our communities are relatively remote. Moved back to his community and was offered a job with the Coastal Guardian Watchman, because somebody on that team believed if we can get him back out on the water, on the land, teach him some skills, boating, forestry, he'll have a job and he can heal. And he did. It's been a couple of years now. He's been with the Coastal Guardian Watchman, and he's begun to learn his language again of his community, his traditional language. And that's exactly the perfect example of what reconciliation means. Carbon offsets fund the Coastal Guardian Watchmen throughout our communities and have been able to bring millions of dollars back to our communities to support that work on the land and the waters. That is one of the more powerful stories that I've heard. And when we think about some of the bigger picture, we had a community established marine protected area a couple of years ago, Kitasoo-Hehe, which is northern Great Bear Rainforest. A lot of that work was funded by revenues of carbon offsets. So again, it's not just even protection of the forest space and conservation and biodiversity, it's of the waters as well, and what that means to our people. As a coastal people, we rely heavily upon the waters to feed families and to generate income in the long term for businesses. And carbon offset revenues, again, have been able to support a lot of that work. Without going too into detail, there is ongoing project for permanence for the Great Bear Sea. And although there is a long-term revenue source today for that work, for many years, marine work and work with federal governments and commercial fisheries has been funded by revenues from carbon offsets. You know, and you mentioned a few others as well, but language programs, several language programs have been supported by carbon offset revenues. And what's key to that is that in a lot of cases, there aren't many people in communities who still know traditional languages. And so for people to be able to, one, return to community in some cases, and to touch that part of themselves to their culture is healing in itself. And I'm, again, very honored to be a part of that. Rights and title is another piece. So recently, the Haida Nation, their rights and title to Haida Gwaii, which is, if you look at a map of Canada in the north, or sorry, on the very west coast, there's a large island that's Haida Gwaii. It was previously called Queen Charlotte Islands. The Haida Nation has had its rights and title recognized, which means they have joint decision-making and lands and resources of that territory. That is huge. A lot of that work has been funded by revenues of carbon offsets.
Thanks, Dani. You know, you use that word return, and that's something that often really resonates with me, and something that I hear a lot is this has the power to return not only the lands and waters to people who, you know, have been stripped of those and who are they're rightfully theirs, but also to like return their spirit, to return that healing, and that's really, I think, the power and the impact that the carbon finance can have in these cases. And on that note of return, I'd love to talk to you, Bryan. You know, you mentioned this in your intro, but you're working on the project that will use carbon revenue to finance the rematriation of those tribal lands. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how that came together, and beyond the return of the land itself, what does that really mean for the nation that you're working with?
Certainly, and in following up on Dani and that question, you know, our belief at the National Unity Carbon Coalition, if you heal the land, you heal the people, and then you heal the culture. So we plan, as we want to rematriate these land bases, to focus on not only restoring the land rights, but then working with the people because of our historical trauma that has been so often fraught within Indian country and indigenous peoples, the trauma that were placed upon peoples for not only relocation, but also the extraction of our natural resources from us by outside parties that did not truly benefit our land bases. So as I mentioned, this project with the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa, again, it was an outside organization that had land ownership rights within the reservation boundaries that degraded the land, that they took all of those timber rights, took the timber off that land, that the tribe was ancestral to these people, that they would hunt, fish, gather. They use fuckery rights, that they have these rights to be able to those lands at all points in time. So it was detrimental to the community, to the people. So what we did is that as these opportunity to reacquire the lands came to fruition, we partnered with the Conservation Fund to take on that acquisition and then do the land transfer to the tribe through one of our other partners, the Indian Land Capital Company, to provide the debt to the tribe. And through the Indian Land Capital Company, we lend at full faith and credit. So there's no collateral, there's nothing tied back to the land itself. So it's tied all to the carbon revenue, which means we have to make the carbon revenue work, which is an important part of all, excuse me, of all these projects. But this is where, again, we believe at the National Unity Carbon Coalition that this could be replicable for all tribal nations that are looking at trying to take land back. And Great Bear was one of the very first that we came across when they designed their project, and we're trying to replicate that model with other tribal nations in the United States. And again, working with, we're gonna get our first First Nation project, hopefully in New Brunswick area, coming up here soon. But again, we think that this is a model that can continue on. So as we design these projects within the marketplace, it's more about trying to avoid all of those extraction industries, whether it be timber or mining or pipelines that come across our lands, in which tribal nations and indigenous peoples do not benefit truly from those activities, and then keep our lands restored and in some sort of preservation status so that we don't have to rely upon outside sources for income on our own lands and keep those lands in future generations, in which we always call an Indian country 7 generations ahead. We want to preserve these lands so that they're not being destroyed and degraded over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned that staying away from the extractive activities, and I think so often it's posed as this trade-off of you can have extraction and revenue generation, or you can have, the lands and waters the way that the people have cared for them, but maybe less revenue. And I think the carbon projects provide a way to bring both of those together and say we can have revenue for the people, we can also, take care of these lands and waters, and we can kind of revitalize the places we're living and the communities that are living there. Yeah. And speaking of common threads running through these projects, Gonzalo, when we connected a couple weeks ago, you talked about how one of the territories that you're working in has a similarly remarkable history of actually an indigenous community buying back its own land from the Crown. Can you talk a little bit about how that history shapes the way that Carbon Plus is approaching the project today?
Yes, of course. So when I first heard about I got the invitation to speak in this panel. I found that it was extremely interesting how 3 North American countries have, of course, these indigenous communities which come from a very different origin, historical processes. But we see, and from this conversation, we see those common denominators pop out. And one of those has to do with how land means, or it's very tied to identity. And in the case of a project in Oaxaca, which is called San Miguel Chimalapa, Chimalapa is the Soque indigenous word for gold. So these recipients that this community was able to provide to the Spanish crown in 1687, so this goes back to the 17th century, in order to buy back their land from that historical, very difficult process. Many communities weren't that lucky or couldn't really afford that. So today, we see this very huge territory covering, it spans more than 100,000 hectares, 134,000 hectares, which for them means everything. Territory, the defense of their territory from external pressures, corporates, and coincidentally or not, that's the way that that forest and jungle has been preserved for centuries. So I find a very interesting and compelling story to how important carbon can be as an alternative to protect these territories in the current moment and for the future.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All 3 of you have really touched on how this is a pathway to real outcomes. We have these carbon projects which are creating the real work, I could say, of strengthening governance, of strengthening sovereignty, of strengthening employment, along with, of course, climate and biodiversity outcomes. But for folks who might not be familiar with community-led carbon projects or maybe even nature-based carbon projects, let's talk about how revenue actually flows in these projects. What is it funding, and who gets to control those decisions? So Dani, let's kick that off with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I will start by saying Great Bear Carbon, the company I represent, is owned by the proponents of the project, so the indigenous communities. The board of directors that I report to are leaders from those communities. And so communities came together to, one, develop the project, create the project, do the government-to-government relations, and ultimately create Great Bear Carbon to then sell the assets into markets, available markets. And so we operate under a revenue sharing model. And so what that means is at no point am I saying, oh, you know what, I like that person from that community. They're going to get more money on this sale. So every community will get the same percentage from every sale that we do. And so there's never a sort of a picking favorites. And when the company was founded, those revenue sharing percentages were agreed upon by leadership, again, from the communities. And so we represent, again, 10 communities in total. And so when we distribute revenues, we operate quarterly, and so we'll distribute revenues every quarter to our limited partners and to all of the communities that we represent. And so decisions for the use of those revenues goes back to those government-to-government conversations when the projects were founded. Without going too long, communities came together in the late 1990s, engaged with government, BC government, to be able to say, hey, we need to create opportunities to grow our communities, to heal our people, and to protect and conserve the land. And so what was developed was a reconciliation protocol. It's not a treaty, it's not a land claims agreement. It's how government, First Nations, Indigenous governments, and provincial government will work together to make decisions, and what initiatives that provincial government will support for those communities to be able to aim to succeed in. And so in that, the pathway for rights of the carbon on that territory were recognized. And so offset revenues are meant to be used for the initiatives listed in the reconciliation protocol that includes protection, conservation, rights and title, coastal guardian watchmen, ecotourism, amongst many initiatives. And so the majority of revenues go to that. A portion, roughly 15%, will go towards community initiatives like language programs, like youth programs, for examples. But the primary focus of those founding agreements of how revenues will be used was for the land and to benefit the people for their work on the land.
Thanks, Dani. What you're illustrating, I think, really points to not only the incredible ways that revenue is flowing, but also the amount of thought and intention that goes into these processes. And so I think for many of us, when we're reading the standards and we're seeing, oh, I have to prove that there's equitable benefit sharing and governance, like this is what that actually means. And this is why that's so important to actually have that carried out in process to really enable that decision-making and local stewardship and those outcomes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gonzalo, anything that you'd like to add from your perspective?
Yes. I was trying to see if we have similarities, which we did definitely do from what we see in other parts of, well, Canada and the US. Definitely one of the most important components for a carbon project in Mexico is to make sure that we have a social justice clause in the revenue sharing schemes. And what we're seeing, it's very common to see how developers plus investors tend to invest and finance the entirety of the development phase of the project, also to find or to be the bridge between the market and the communities. And then the communities get to decide, this is a very, very important, in their own assemblies and their governance bodies, how they are going to first share the eventual revenue, but also how to reinvest. That's very, very important in ecotourism, productive social and environmental projects. Of course, for forestry, improved forest management, better practices, which is very, very difficult because there are so many immediate needs that we work hand in hand to make sure that we see these projects as a long-term solution rather than just an immediate one-year solution. We have to see them, and that's part of the permanence, and how that governance from the community, creating their own committees to make sure that revenue is reinvested for social and environmental purposes as well.
Mm-hmm. And what you said about developers serving as a bridge is critical. Something that I see frequently is that some folks will say, oh, those community-led projects are so important, they're so inspiring, but that's not for me to get involved in. But what you're illustrating is it's absolutely for everyone to get involved in. There's a really important role for developers, for investors, for buyers in enabling these community projects. And I think you spoke to this, the importance of partnerships when you gave your introduction as well. Is there anything you'd like to add on this?
Yeah, and one of the things that we definitely want to focus on when we engage with these tribal nations and indigenous communities is that they are the decision makers. You know, the partnerships that we bring to the table, and even we at the National Indian Carbon Coalition, we are there to facilitate the process. And as those partners is to assist to ensure that the project is a success at the end of the day, but the the tribal members, the tribal staff, the tribal leaders are the decision makers throughout the entirety of the project. And like Gonzalo, we want to ensure that the tribal nation that we engage with creates a steering committee or an advisory committee, or we just call them a carbon working group, made up of leadership, staff, and membership of that community to come and make these decisions on how the project is not only going to be designed, but then also what is the revenue going to be utilized for within that tribal community itself. So for instance, with one of the tribes that we're engaged with, they're currently using the revenue to develop a tribal school. So the school was built in the 60s by the federal government. It housed 400 students. Their current student base was 550 kids. So they were putting children in trailers and out back that didn't have bathrooms or air conditioning, and this was down in Mississippi. So they were struggling to have capacity. So based upon the carbon revenue, then that the tribe decided how they wanted to do this. This was their decision, utilizing the carbon revenue to do a $22 million school build with all a brand new system for their tribal community to house over 1,000 students as their schools grow over time. So now they have the new STEM facilities, they have the new athletic fields, the new auditorium for their students as their communities grow. And again, this was an initiative led internally by the tribal members, the tribal staffs themselves that said, we not only want to enter our lands into a carbon project to protect and preserve our land base, but we also want to utilize the revenue for community initiatives, and this is how the community itself decided on where this revenue was going to be impactful for their people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think the work that all three of you are doing really has shown how the carbon markets are, as they should be, starting to move toward really respecting and uplifting indigenous, traditional, and local communities as true rights holders, decision makers, not merely as beneficiaries, which I think is so critical of the important work that you're all doing.
And that's one of the things as we talk about these revenue sharing. We at the National Carbon Coalition, when we engage with these communities, we act as the project proponent and we contract directly with the tribal nation or indigenous community, but we ensure within that contract that entity retains ownership control over all of the credits and the process the entire time. So we want to make sure that they have that control. And then within our revenue share agreements, we want to ensure that that organization takes at least 85% of the revenue to get back through the project, because obviously that's the whole intent of these things, is to derive revenue for community initiatives. So we want to ensure that happens. And again, we are a nonprofit organization, so we don't need to generate a lot of revenue, but what we had seen on the very front end of these projects was that a lot of tribes could not participate and a lot of landowners could not participate in the markets themselves because they didn't have the capital initially to be able to go through the development phase. So we at the National Carbon Coalition, working with many different partners, developed a financial campaign to fund the costs that we now cover as tribes want to engage in these markets, to cover those expenses for the entire development phase, because these, as we all know, are multiple year projects that take to be developed, and tribes just did not have the financial capacity or capability to cover those on their own. So now, through some campaigns that we were able to raise funds for, we cover those expenses, we hold those costs for the benefit of our tribal partners so that they do not have to come to the table with any capital on the front end. We do get reimbursed those expenses once we begin selling the carbon credits. So that again, there's, when we first do our engagement, we talk about no cost, no commitment to the tribes. Like, we'll work with you. You don't have to put in, besides staff time, any dollars until this thing shows to be a success, if you so choose to move forward with project development. So we're really trying to structure these projects to make them impactful and as easy as possible for tribal nations and indigenous communities to engage and to enter into these markets, because it does take a long period of time. And again, like Gonzalo was saying, we at the National Carbon Coalition, as we entered into these agreements, we partner for the entirety of the project. So we contract for 40 years because we operate in the voluntary carbon market to make sure that they have that trusted partner there the whole time, because we can't just leave our tribal partners and our indigenous partners after 3 or 4 years once the project's complete. That's not the end of the story. There's a lot that goes on afterwards. As we all know, when we engage with our communities, that's just the small part of it.
Mm-hmm. Let's dive more into that note on participation, because I think that for someone unfamiliar with the process, this could sound quite daunting, no matter what side of the markets you're approaching this from. Dani, I know when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned that Great Bear Carbon represents communities who have been able to sell hundreds of thousands of tons into the market. So what advice would you give for a community who's considering this path, but maybe doesn't have clear rights, clear title, clear capacity? What might this journey look like for them?
Yeah, just a quick correction, we've sold millions.
Thank you.
But we did sell hundreds of thousands last year into the first year of a compliance market in British Columbia. And under that first year, it was such a huge success and massive opportunity for us. In terms of the rights and title, that jurisdiction conversation is not an easy one. Bryan's working with some communities in Eastern Canada. The conversation there about what's possible is very different than it is on the west coast of Canada. And this is just Canada. I will only speak to my knowledge of how these opportunities look in Canada. If you're on private lands, it's a bit more straightforward. Private lands can be developed under federal program or voluntary markets, and that pathway is pretty clear. If you've got the deed to the land, you can develop that project, of course, with the supporting additionality. That's another conversation. It might be another panel, actually. But in Canada, much of Canada is Crown lands. And so understanding how do then you create a carbon project on Crown lands. Our communities refer to their territories as their traditional territories. Government will refer to it as Crown lands. Our projects, the Great Bear Forest carbon projects and on Haida Gwaii, are based on Crown lands. And so how did we get the rights to be able to develop the project? Through an atmospheric benefit sharing agreement. And so an agreement between indigenous governments, provincial government, that recognizes the rights and title of the community's right to the carbon sequestered and generated on the land. And so that is how we hold that integrity piece, that rights and title on a Crown land context in Canada. That conversation isn't easy outside of British Columbia. And other provinces, governments don't yet have a clear pathway of how to engage with communities, how to engage in terms of creating opportunities, never mind a carbon project. There are provinces in Canada that don't have carbon systems really set up that allow for these conversations to even be mentioned. It is changing, it is growing as Canada grows, as our markets grow and opportunities grow, but again, specific to Crown lands, you need to have a pathway with government to government conversations, engagement, to be able to get that rights and title recognized. The risk to a community publicly asserting their own rights to their territory is government making a change to the land without the permission of the community. Although I'd like to think in this day and age that doesn't happen quite as often, but it's not unrealistic and it has happened in the past. And so, as a carbon market actor, that integrity piece to the land base and being able to ensure that there aren't going to be changes to the land base that affect the project is so important, it's so critical for the long-term success of what's possible for our community.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And I'm curious, for the developers, the investors, the buyers who might be in the room, I'm convinced, I think all three of you have done a fantastic job really driving home just the impact, the inspiration, the importance of these projects. But if someone is still maybe not sold, how would you make the case to them for really prioritizing community-led carbon projects beyond just the right thing to do?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Bryan. Well, I want to hear you too, because I think you can give a superb answer. So I think we are privileged as developers on this territory, because there are many parts of the world where carbon is just carbon. Or for example, not just carbon, but there are not many ways to complement with, for example, a very, very clear social impact that comes from carbon. And I think that makes us extremely privileged because we can really focus on a development project instead of just an environmental or a climate project with carbon. And that obviously brings a lot of challenges for us because it's very, very difficult to talk to so many people from a community that for the first time are hearing something that for them it's quite mysterious, very difficult to explain, many times invisible. For example, how to explain that a tree is capturing carbon, but you don't actually see that. It has an intangibility by itself, and from the technical side of things. So for me, as an investor, as a client, we really are doing projects that focus on development and to make sure that these communities can be better off than when we started out of the carbon revenue. So for us, that's key in order to help the climate, but also help our communities to succeed.
So I'm going to be obviously quite biased because in my opinion as a tribal member working with tribal nations, we have been here for time immemorial and we're going to be here for time immemorial. So we have the rights and the decision-making rights over our land bases. So to me, anybody in the audience that if you want to engage with a landowner that has long-term decision-making goals in mind, work with tribal and indigenous communities because we want to steward our land appropriately and correctly for the long term. So as we engage with our tribal nation partners, we look at, again, 7 generations ahead of us. How is this land going to be impactful? Because we in Indian country cannot just pick up the exterior boundaries of our reservation and move our lands to somewhere else. So we have to plan for climate change as it impacts our natural resources within our reservation lands. So we enter and explore climate adaptation plans as we see different resources transition outside of our lands and new resources come in because things are a-changing and it's due to climate change and tribes are preparing for this change because we know that's coming and we've seen it throughout our history for this to occur. So through our traditional ecological knowledge, when we talk to our elders, when we lost the bison in the plains, and why do our elk now get sick? Because the bison would eat a different stalk of grass compared to what the elk would eat, and the elk would get worms and be unedible by the hunters because the elk were getting sick. It was because the bison are no longer around to get rid of all of the poo that everybody was putting out onto the plains because the bison would drive that into the ground as a fertilizer to keep that ecosystem healthy for all of the other animals. So reintroduction of the bison is important for a lot of our communities. And these are the plans that we are seeing that is not only being driven as initiatives by the tribes, but then following back upon the carbon revenue that's being generated on some of these projects that they're seeing. Like, again, if we don't do an extraction technique, like a timber harvest or allow a pipeline or dig up the minerals underneath our ground, and we put a carbon project on this, we can protect those lands and we can do the reintroduction of these flora and fauna that were lost, that were culturally important to our communities over time. So again, I'm going to be 100% biased here. We've been here for time immemorial. We're going to be here for time immemorial. You want to work with landowners that are going to make good stewardship decisions, come work with tribal and indigenous communities.
Yeah. No one better positioned to be thinking long-term and knowing how to manage the lands. Absolutely. Yeah. Dani?
I think we're at a point with carbon projects, non-removal based projects, IFM, forestry, where the co-benefits or core benefits are at the forefront. There needs to be more than just that, than just the sequestration of carbon. That's key, obviously. That has to be right beside. But the reality is how can carbon revenues benefit people on the land? Those may not be indigenous people depending on the type of project that's looking to be developed. But nonetheless, it has to be beyond more than just that sequestration. Where do the revenues go? What I would say to anybody in the audience that has genuine good intent and wants to create great projects is exactly what Bryan has said, is work with the landowners, work with the people who have a long-term vision and investment into that territory. And that won't happen overnight. You know, as a salesperson, I represent the communities, and that means I have to work with people that align with our values. The values of our company are the values of our communities. And so that means we can't always sell to everybody who comes knocking on the door. It's not often we'll say no, I will add, but it takes time to build good relationships to go into business together. So I think what I would say to anybody who does have a vision of creating a project, work with the communities of that territory, spend time building a relationship before making your proposal is so key, and I can't stress that enough. It's not just about business, it's about that long-term relationship. Carbon projects are not a short-term thing to take on together, and so you have to be sure the relationship is right and that there's alignment. Ownership and transparency are also key in this conversation. Who owns the offsets? Is it the investor who put in the money for development? Is it the community? Is it 50-50? Is it 49-51? Who's going to sell the offsets once they've been issued? All of these questions need to be clear right from the start. We do hear, unfortunately, as market actors of those tough projects where there's being claims made, oh, X amount of revenues are going back to communities when that's actually not the case. Or they're going for these purposes when that's not actually the case. So being clear and transparent right at the front is so critical. Whereas I think we hear of, I like to call them carbon cowboys who have a different agenda about how they're going to make money off of offset revenues. I like to think I don't. There's not too many of them. I've certainly come by them. And for the most part, people working in this space are good. They have good intent. This work is personal, I think, for everybody in the room. It certainly is for me, as you saw from my emotions at the start. But again, building relationship, ownership, transparency need to be at the forefront of your mind if this is something that you're looking to engage with.
Thank you. Yeah, everything good takes time and is built on relationship. And this is about so much more than the carbon. The carbon is a very important part of it, but if at the end of the day, we sequester all the carbon but don't make anybody's lives better in the process, then what are we really doing? So thank you for sharing that. Well, I want to leave time for a few questions, but as we wrap up, maybe just one quick phrase from each of you. If you could change one thing about how carbon markets work so that they could better serve communities, what would that be, Gonzalo?
Seeing carbon just as an economic instrument and not providing all the background that comes with that. So it's obviously very important to price carbon, as we know, but how can you put a price to what we've been discussing? So for me, it would be that.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to piggyback right on that, because that's my concern as well, is the market analysis for tribal and indigenous-led carbon credit generation. I mean, again, 100% biased, but I think our credits are more valuable than any other credits out there, and we need that price point to reflect that.
Making room for everybody at the table, not just the people with money. I'll just say that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, all three of you. I'd like to open it up for questions. We have time for probably 2 or 3, I would say. So feel free to raise your hand if we have any questions. Right here in the front.
You can just shout it.
I can repeat it if you shout it if we don't have a microphone.
Okay, no, I'll get up. First of all, thank you very much for this panel. It was really interesting. Lisa, you did a really good job moderating and asking really interesting questions. Dani, Bryan, Gonzalo, thank you. Is it working? Is it working? It was really a pleasure for us as an audience to listen on how do you work and create impact in your projects. It was really emotional to listen to you, Dani. And I have a question for Gonzalo, thinking in the North American, most of all in Mexico. You mentioned this project, the San Miguel project. How do you think that this project can make high quality, high integrity, nature-based solution, and how do you integrate the communities in the design of the project?
Yes, thank you, Manuel. So I think we've been discussing this earlier, which is not just on the revenue sharing scheme. So what are the governance bodies that existed before the carbon project that can be fortified with it? And also if something else is needed that, well, needs a new creation. So we've seen that for investors, for clients, it's very important to have transparency in who are taking the decisions within the community, not just for economic purposes, but also in terms of social components and reinvestments. And it's very important to be transparent from day one between developers, aligning values, as you say, very, very important, and then how we're transmitting that to the market and to investors who perhaps are from a different, or come from a different perspective or background, geography. How can we explain what's going on the land? That's key in order to have permanence and additionality, strengthen to become a high integrity project.
And that was a great question, and I wanted to touch on that, which didn't get a chance to. It's, again, in my opinion, tribal nations and indigenous communities can not only be generators of high quality, high integrity projects, but can also be the leaders in the industry to show other landowners how these projects can be appropriately designed. And we have seen a lot of the negativity in the past from indigenous communities that have been taken advantage of globally. And I think that paradigm can shift now by how we are starting to see some of these projects like Great Bear that is showing how projects can be designed appropriately and correctly that then do benefit our communities and be true leaders within this industry as a whole by engaging with tribal nations and indigenous communities that want to steward this land and then, again, show the high quality, high integrity of these projects. And so, again, 100% biased, but we should be the top of the leaders here and engage with the tribes and the partners that you guys see, because we are not always just, indigenous peoples in the global south. We are right here next door neighbors to you. We don't just go hide in other areas of the world. We're on the stage right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And showing how it's done.
Right from that design phase, there needs to be clarity as well in what market is being developed in. And I say this, in mind that the projects I work for are developed under a provincial program, so it's not voluntary, but that means that we can sell into both voluntary and compliance markets. And when depending on your jurisdiction, that compliance market opportunity could be huge. And I'll give an example of, we generate roughly 1.3 million offsets to be able to sell per vintage year. We get an average price roughly $21 per ton in a voluntary market. In last year's compliance market, we sold at $65 per ton. And this year we're selling at $77.50 as that tax price goes up to be able to create the incentive for heavy emitters. So that's a huge part of that development design phase, and that everybody at the table should understand what those opportunities are and how to engage with those different markets depending on that decision. It's so key, I think, to the opportunity.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Wonderful. Well, I think we've definitely seen that these are the people, these are the organizations that are really leading the way in showing what's possible for carbon markets and how projects can truly create that myriad benefits of not just the carbon and the climate, but also truly supporting and uplifting the communities and their values. So please join me in a round of applause for these three folks. And I know we didn't get to a lot of questions, but I'm sure they'll stick around for, maybe not Bryan, I know you've got plans.
I'm out of here.
But a couple of folks can stick around if people do have questions. Thanks, everyone.